Story. Struggling single dad rescues a girl from a frozen lake. She turned out to be a billionaire. The cold was a living thing in Liam's small apartment. It seeped through the window frames, breathed a ghostly mist against the panes, and settled deep into the building's old bones. The radiator in the corner, a cast-iron beast from a bygone era, offered its protest with a series of mournful clanks and groans before surrendering to a tepid silence. Liam stood in the galley kitchen, his breath a faint cloud in the air, and watched a single egg sizzle in a worn-out pan. One egg. That was it for today. He'd split it with Chloe, and his own portion would be mostly for show. Coffee, black and bitter, would be his breakfast. At 35, Liam felt 100. The lines around his eyes weren't from laughter. They were etchings of fatigue, carved by 2 jobs and a grief that had never fully loosened its grip. His hands, calloused from stocking shelves at a warehouse during the day and pushing a janitor's mop at night, were clumsy as he slid the cooked egg onto a chipped plate. He was a ghost moving through his own life, a silent automaton programmed for a single purpose. Chloe. His daughter, his 7-year-old son, was the one thing the cold couldn't touch. He heard the soft patter of her slippered feet on the linoleum floor before he saw her. She appeared in the doorway, a mess of sleep-tousled brown hair and wide, curious eyes that held the last lingering warmth of her mother. "Is it morning, Daddy?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Liam forced a smile, the gesture feeling like stretching a muscle long unused. "It is, sweet pea, and I have a royal breakfast for the princess." Chloe giggled as he presented the plate with a mock bow. She knew their game. He was the valiant knight. She was the princess. And their tiny apartment was a castle under siege by the dragons of the world outside. She never seemed to notice that their castle was drafty, or that the royal feasts were often meager. To her, the magic was real because he made it so. As she ate her half of the egg, with the delicate seriousness of a food critic, Liam leaned against the counter, nursing his mug of coffee. His gaze drifted to a small framed photo on the shelf. It was of him and Sarah, his wife, taken on a beach just a year before she got sick. Her laugh was so vivid in his memory that he could almost hear it over the sighing of the wind outside. The illness had been a thief, swift and merciless. It had stolen her first, and then it had come for everything else. The medical bills had piled up into a mountain of debt so high he could no longer see the summit. He'd sold their car, her jewelry, anything of value, until all that was left were the 4 walls of this apartment and the memories that haunted them. He worked from 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the warehouse, a blur of cardboard boxes and aching muscles. Then, a quick bus ride home to be with Chloe for a few hours, homework, dinner, a story before heading out again at 9 p.m. to clean a downtown office building, a silent, solitary job that gave his worries too much room to breathe. Sleep came in fractured, 3-hour increments. It was a relentless, soul-crushing cycle, but every time he felt himself start to drown, Chloe's smile was the hand that pulled him back to the surface. "Daddy," Chloe said, pulling him from his reverie, "the walls are sad today." He looked where she was pointing. The paint was peeling near the ceiling, and the walls were bare, save for the colorful crayon drawings she had taped up. They were her contribution to the castle's decor: a lopsided sun, a purple cat, a stick figure portrait of the 2 of them holding hands. "You're right," Liam said, his voice soft. "They need more color. We'll have to make some new art later." "Can we go to the park?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. "To the big lake? Maybe it's an ice palace now, like in the movie." Liam's heart sank a little. A trip to the park felt like a luxury he couldn't afford, not in time, not in energy. But then he saw the hopeful, expectant look on her face, and he knew he couldn't refuse. What else did he have to give her? He couldn't give her new toys or fancy clothes. He could only give her these small moments, these little adventures that made her feel like a princess in a magical kingdom. "An ice palace, huh?" he mused. "I bet it is." "Okay, sweet pea. After I get my papers sorted, we'll go on an expedition." The papers were a small, dreaded pile on the corner of the kitchen table. Bills, mostly. He sifted through them while Chloe finished her drawing, his stomach twisting with each envelope. The electric bill, higher than last month because of the failing radiator. The credit card statement, its balance a monument to his financial ruin. And then he saw it. It was different from the others. The envelope was a harsh, industrial brown. the window revealing his name and address typed in a cold, impersonal font. He knew what it was before he even opened it. He'd been expecting it, dreading it, for weeks. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open. The paper inside was thick, official. The words seemed to leap off the page, each one a hammer blow. Final notice. Failure to remit payment. Eviction proceedings to commence in 14 days. The air left his lungs in a rush. 14 days, 2 weeks. The walls of the apartment, the very castle he'd built for his daughter, suddenly felt like they were made of cardboard, ready to collapse at the slightest push. He felt a wave of dizziness, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He quickly folded the letter and shoved it deep into his pocket, his movements stiff and jerky. He looked over at Chloe. She was humming to herself, meticulously coloring in a golden crown on her stick-figure father's head. She was oblivious, safe in her world of crayons and ice palaces. And in that moment, Liam felt a surge of fierce, desperate love that was so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He would not let her see him break. He would not let the dragons win. Not today. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the panic down, burying it under a layer of resolve as thick as he could manage. He walked over to her and knelt down, his smile feeling brittle, like a mask about to crack. "All right, Princess Chloe," he said, his voice miraculously steady. "The royal papers are sorted. Are you ready for our expedition to the Great Ice Palace?" Her face erupted in a joyous grin. "Yes." The simple, pure happiness in her voice was both a comfort and a dagger. He was her hero, her protector, and he was failing her. The thought was a physical pain in his chest. He helped her into her winter coat. It was bright pink, but it was getting a little too short in the sleeves, and he'd had to patch a small tear near the pocket with clumsy, uneven stitches. He zipped it all the way up to her chin, his fingers lingering for a moment on the soft fabric. It was thin, too thin for the biting wind that awaited them, but it was all they had. He pulled on his own jacket, a threadbare garment that offered more psychological comfort than actual warmth. He took one last look around the small apartment at the peeling paint, the worn furniture, the single photo of his smiling wife. It was a failing castle, a kingdom on the brink of collapse. But for the next hour, he would pretend. For Chloe, he would be the brave knight leading her on a grand adventure. He would push the terrifying words from the letter out of his mind and focus only on the warmth of her small, mittened hand in his. He took that hand, a small, warm anchor in a sea of cold uncertainty, and opened the door. The biting winter air rushed in to greet them, a harsh preview of the world that lay in wait. Together, they stepped out to face it. While Liam and Chloe stepped out into a world defined by its biting, physical cold, Alara Vance existed in a cold of a different nature. It was a sterile, silent chill that permeated the very air of the Vance family mansion, a sprawling architectural marvel of glass, steel, and white marble that felt less like a home and more like a modern art museum where she was the most valuable and most lifeless exhibit. She stood in the center of the cavernous living room, a space so large it seemed to swallow sound. A single 20-foot-tall wall of tempered glass offered a panoramic, godlike view of the city below, its lights just beginning to twinkle against the bruised purple of the late afternoon sky. Outside, the wind howled, a distant and impotent cry against the triple-paned, soundproofed glass. Inside, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of perfect, engineered silence that only immense wealth could buy, and Alara had never felt more imprisoned by it. A year had passed since her father, a titan of the tech industry named Alistair Vance, had succumbed to a sudden heart attack. He had been a force of nature, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his ambition. He had built Vance Industries from a garage startup into a global conglomerate, and he had raised Alara to be his successor. But he had taught her about code, not about grief. He had prepared her for boardrooms, not for the crushing emptiness he would leave behind. Now, at 24, she was the sole heir, the face on the cover of business magazines, the custodian of a multi-billion-dollar empire. And she was a ghost. Her days were a meticulously curated schedule, managed by others. 8 a.m., breakfast with the CFO to discuss quarterly earnings. 10 a.m., a video conference with the Tokyo office. 1 p.m., a working lunch with the legal team to review patent litigation. People spoke at her, presenting data points and projections on sleek tablets. They used words like synergy, monetization, and shareholder value. They smiled polite, professional smiles, their eyes assessing her, calculating. No one asked how she was. No one seemed to notice the hollow look in her eyes or the way her hands, hidden beneath the mahogany boardroom table, trembled ever so slightly. They saw the heiress, the asset, the continuation of Alistair Vance's legacy. They didn't see the girl who still woke up some nights thinking she heard her father's laugh down the hall. Mr. Harrison, her father's long-serving and impeccably loyal executive assistant, entered the room so quietly she didn't hear him until he spoke. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a smooth, respectful baritone. "Your car is ready. The fundraiser at the gallery begins in an hour." She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant, frozen lake in the city park below, a sliver of silver visible between the skyscrapers. It was a place she hadn't visited in years, but one that held a sudden, powerful pull. "I'm not going," she said, her voice flat. Harrison paused. It was his job to manage deviations from the schedule, but her recent deviations were becoming more frequent, more erratic. "The foundation is honoring your father's memory tonight, Miss Vance. Your presence is expected." "Oh, my presence is a performance, Arthur," she replied, finally turning to face him. He saw the deep, weary sadness in her eyes that the board members chose to ignore. "I'm tired of performing. I'm tired of this house. I'm tired of the silence." Her gaze drifted back to the window, to the lake. She remembered going there with her father when she was a little girl, before Vance Industries had become an all-consuming giant. He taught her how to skip stones across the water in the summer. In the winter, he'd held her hand tightly as they walked along the snowy shore, telling her how ice was one of nature's most beautiful and dangerous tricks. "It looks solid, Alara," he'd said, his breath fogging in the air, "but you always have to respect the hidden weakness beneath." She craved that simple reality now. Not the calculated risk of a stock portfolio, but the raw, honest danger of nature. She wanted to feel something, anything other than this suffocating, gilded numbness. The cold of the wind, the sting of ice, the shock of reality. It felt more honest than the climate-controlled perfection of her life. "Cancel the fundraiser," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of resolve. "Tell them I'm unwell, and tell my driver to take the evening off." "Miss Vance, is that wise? Your security?" "I want to be alone, Arthur," she stated, a note of finality in her tone that even he couldn't argue with. "For just a little while. I'm going for a walk." "Oh." He bowed his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of his defeat. "As you wish, Miss Vance." He retreated, leaving her once again in the crushing silence. Ilara walked over to the hall closet, a cavernous space filled with designer coats and cashmere scarves. She ignored them all. Tucked in the very back, she found what she was looking for, a simple, dark gray wool coat. It had been her mother's, a woman she barely remembered, who had left when Ilara was 5, unable to live in the shadow of her husband's ambition. The coat was plain, anonymous. Perfect. She slipped it on, ignoring the chauffeur and the security detail waiting discreetly by the main entrance. She used a side door, one that led to the gardens, and slipped out into the biting wind. The cold was a shock, a slap in the face that was both painful and exhilarating. It was real. For the first time all day, she felt her senses awaken. The crunch of her expensive leather boots on the frosted ground, the sharp scent of pine from the manicured hedges, the feeling of the wind tearing at her hair. She walked without a destination in mind, her feet eventually carrying her out of the manicured perfection of her neighborhood and onto the public sidewalks of the city. No one recognized her. Without the designer clothes, the entourage, and the gleaming black car, she was just another young woman hunched against the cold. The invisibility she had so often felt as a curse now felt like a liberation. Her path led her, as she knew it would, to the park. The entrance was quiet, the usual throngs of joggers and families replaced by a stark, wintry emptiness. The trees were skeletal, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. Her gaze was fixed on the lake. Chloe's ice palace. It was a vast, unbroken sheet of white, shimmering with a strange ethereal light as the sun began its final descent. It looked solid, peaceful, eternal. It looked like the silence she craved, but a natural silence, not the artificial, suffocating one of her mansion. She didn't know why she was doing it, It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an impulse, a pull from a place deeper than thought. She wanted to stand in the center of that silence, to feel the world fall away, to be utterly and completely alone with the memory of her father and the ghost of the girl she used to be. She stepped off the snowy bank and onto the ice. Her boots made a soft, crunching sound on the frozen surface. It felt firm, secure. She walked slowly, deliberately, venturing further from the shore. The city noises faded behind her, replaced by the whispering of the wind across the ice. The cold was seeping through her simple coat now, a deep chill that reached her bones, but she welcomed it. It was a feeling. It was real. She finally stopped near the center. The shore seemed a world away. She was surrounded by a vast, silent expanse of white. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the crushing weight of being Alara Vance, heir to an empire, lifted. She was just a girl, standing on a frozen lake, lost in a memory of a father teaching her how to skip stones. A profound, aching sense of peace washed over her. She was not trying to end her life. She was just trying to pause it, to find a single, frozen moment of stillness in a world that never stopped moving. She was so lost in that stillness that she didn't feel the subtle shift beneath her feet. She didn't hear the first faint groan of the ice, a sound like a distant sigh. She only felt the world give way when it was already too late. On the shore, the world was small and safe, contained in a father's reassuring presence. Liam pointed out the intricate frost patterns on a park bench, showing Chloe how each crystal was a tiny, unique star. For a fleeting moment, the eviction notice in his pocket felt like a distant nightmare, eclipsed by the simple joy of his daughter's laughter as she tried to catch a snowflake on her tongue. They were a tiny island of warmth in the encroaching twilight. Out on the lake, Alara was on an island of her own, one of profound and silent solitude. The peace she had sought was complete. The city, her mansion, the endless meetings they had all receded, becoming insignificant specks on a distant shore. Here, there was only the vast white canvas of the ice and the gray, forgiving sky. She was suspended in a moment between memory and oblivion, a fragile truce with the world. The two worlds, Liam's of paternal love and Alara's of lonely introspection, existed in parallel, separated by 100 yards of frozen water. And then, with the suddenness of a camera flash, they collided. It began not as a sound, but as a vibration. A deep, guttural groan that traveled up from the depths of the lake, through the ice, and into the soles of Alara's boots. Her eyes snapped open, her peaceful trance shattered. A jagged, black line, thin as a hair, materialized before her. It raced across the white surface like a spark along a fuse. Then came the sound. It wasn't a single crack. It was a symphony of destruction. A sharp, violent report like a gunshot, followed by a chorus of splintering, cracking, and groaning as the immense tension in the ice gave way. The single black line spiderwebbed into a dozen, then 100, forming a treacherous mosaic beneath her feet. A primal scream tore from Alara's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that cut through the winter air. The solid ground she had been standing on disintegrated. One moment, she was on a vast, white plain. The next, the world fell away, and she was plunged into a nightmare of black, agonizingly cold water. The shock was absolute, a full-body cataclysm. The cold wasn't just cold, it was a physical blow, an electric shock that stole her breath and paralyzed her muscles. It was a vicious, living entity, instantly seeping through her wool coat, her clothes, her skin, seeking out her very core. The darkness was disorienting. Her mind, which seconds before had been blissfully empty, was now a maelstrom of panic. Down. I'm going down. On the shore, Liam's head whipped around at the sound of the scream. He saw the spot where the girl had been standing, now a roiling patch of dark water in the pristine white. "Daddy!" Chloe shrieked, her small hand clutching his jacket. All the anxieties of his life, the rent, the bills, the exhaustion vanished, burned away by a single, blinding imperative. A human being was in the water. "Chloe, stay right here," he commanded, his voice sharp with an authority she had never heard before. He pushed her gently but firmly behind the relative safety of a thick oak tree. "Don't move from this spot. Do you understand? Stay here." "Oh." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, tears already welling. He didn't have a second to comfort her. He was already running. His worn boots slipped on the snowy bank as he sprinted towards the edge of the lake. He didn't have a plan, only an instinct. He knew you couldn't run on thin ice. As he reached the edge, he threw himself forward, landing flat on his stomach. The impact knocked the wind from him, but he ignored it, using his arms and legs to propel himself forward in a low, desperate crawl. The ice groaned under his weight. He could feel its instability, see smaller cracks branching out from his hands. Every inch was a gamble. The cold from the ice seeped through his thin jacket, a numbing preview of the water ahead. His focus narrowed to a single point, the dark, churning hole in the ice. Elle era surfaced, gasping, flailing. The weight of her waterlogged coat was an anchor, dragging her down. Her limbs were already stiffening, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. The cold was a fire in her lungs, and the panic was a thick fog in her brain. She saw the shore, impossibly far away. She saw the darkening sky, and then she saw him. A dark shape, low against the white, moving towards her. "Hold on." The voice was a raw, desperate shout across the ice. The sound cut through her panic, a single point of light in the overwhelming darkness. A hand. She had to reach for it. Liam saw her head dip below the surface and then reappear. He knew he was running out of time. He pushed himself faster, the rough surface of the ice scraping his palms raw through his cheap gloves. The hole was just feet away now. He could see her face, pale and terrified, her lips already tinged with blue. "I've got you," he yelled, his voice strained with effort. "Just hold on." He reached the edge of the broken ice, the water sloshing mere inches from his face. He extended his right arm as far as he could, his fingers stretching, straining. "Give me your hand." Her movements were weak, sluggish. She raised an arm, her hand barely breaking the surface. Their fingers brushed, missed. He pushed himself forward another inch, the ice beneath his chest creaking ominously. He lunged again. This time his fingers closed around her wrist. The contact was a shock to them both. Her skin was unnaturally, terrifyingly cold. Her wrist was slick, and his grip felt precarious. For her, his hand was a sudden, solid point of warmth and strength in a world that had dissolved into cold chaos. "I've got you," he said again, his voice now a low, determined grunt. "Don't fight me. I'm pulling you up." He began to pull. The dead weight was immense. Her saturated coat, combined with her limp body, felt like pulling a block of concrete from the water. His muscles screamed in protest, his back arched, every sinew straining. The ice beneath him groaned louder, a long, mournful sound. He felt a crack shoot out from under his elbow. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through him. "We're both going in." He ignored it. He planted his feet as best he could, digging the toes of his boots into the ice, and gave a tremendous heave. Alara's torso cleared the water. She coughed, a weak, sputtering sound, spewing icy water. She was heavier than she looked, a dead weight he couldn't seem to leverage. His grip was slipping. He couldn't do it like this. In a split-second decision, he shifted his weight, freeing his other hand. He plunged it into the freezing water, the pain so intense it was like being stabbed with 1,000 needles. He grabbed a handful of her coat's collar, getting a more secure hold. Almost there, he gasped, his own breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. With one final desperate surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he pulled. She slid out of the water and onto the ice with a wet, heavy slump, a tangle of limbs and soaking fabric. She was out. For a moment, they just lay there, side by side on the treacherous ice, both gasping for air. Liam was shivering uncontrollably, the water from her clothes and his own submerged arms soaking into his jacket, freezing him instantly. Alara was barely conscious, her eyes half closed, her body trembling violently. But they were alive. They were on the ice, not under it. The realization snapped Liam out of his stupor. They weren't safe yet. The ice was compromised. He had to get them to shore. "Hey," he said, his voice rough as he shook her shoulder gently. "Can you hear me? We have to move." She only moaned in response, a faint, incoherent sound. She was succumbing to hypothermia, and fast. He knew he couldn't drag her. Their combined weight would be too much. He had to carry her. Without a second thought, he shrugged out of his own thin, soaked jacket and draped it over her. It was a pathetic offering against the severe cold, but it was all he had. He maneuvered himself behind her, slid his arms under hers, and got to his feet in a clumsy, precarious crouch. He lifted. Her body was a leaden weight, but the fear for her life and the image of his own daughter waiting for him on the shore gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He cradled her against his chest and began the slow, treacherous journey back. Each step was a prayer. He didn't retrace his path, but moved towards a closer section of the shore, his eyes scanning the ice for any sign of weakness. His teeth chattered, his body screamed with cold and exhaustion, but all he could think about was the fragile life in his arms and the small, terrified girl waiting for him under a tree. He was no longer just a struggling father or a man worried about bills. He was a protector, a rescuer, a lifeline against the encroaching dark. The journey from the ice to the shore was a blur of searing cold and burning effort. Liam's world had shrunk to the next careful step, the dead weight of the unconscious girl in his arms, and the sound of his own ragged breathing. When his feet finally hit the solid, snow-covered ground of the bank, a wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed over him. He staggered forward a few more feet before his legs gave out, and he gently lowered Alara to the ground near the base of the oak tree where Chloe was waiting. Chloe ran to him, her face a mess of tear-streaked dirt and terror. "Daddy, Daddy, you're all wet." "I'm okay, sweet pea. I'm okay," he managed to say. His teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. He pulled his daughter into a fierce, one-armed hug, holding her tight as much for his own reassurance as for hers. The girl on the ground moaned softly, her body racked with violent shivers. Her skin was a ghostly, waxy white, and her lips were a frightening shade of blue. Liam knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that she needed help immediately. He fumbled in his pocket with numb, clumsy fingers, pulling out his cheap, cracked smartphone. The screen was wet. He wiped it frantically on his jeans, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Please work. Please." The screen flickered to life. He stabbed at the numbers 911, his thumb barely obeying his commands. The dispatcher's voice was calm, a surreal counterpoint to the chaos of the moment. 911. "What's your emergency?" "A girl. She fell through the ice." Liam stammered, his voice hoarse. "At the City Park Lake. We're on the west bank, near the old oak grove. She's unconscious. Hypothermia. Severe." He gave the details in short, clipped sentences, the training from a long-forgotten workplace safety course surfacing from the depths of his memory. As he spoke, a man who had been jogging nearby, alerted by the commotion, ran over. "I saw the whole thing," the jogger said, already shrugging off his own thick, dry fleece jacket. "Here, use this." Together, they carefully removed Liam's soaking jacket from Alara and wrapped her in the jogger's warm, dry one. The small act of teamwork, of shared humanity, was a flicker of warmth in the freezing air. Sirens began to wail in the distance, a sound that was both a relief and an intrusion. The paramedics arrived with an efficiency that was both awesome and impersonal. They descended on Alara, a whirlwind of blankets, oxygen masks, and urgent professional jargon. Liam found himself pushed to the periphery, standing shivering with Chloe huddled against his leg. He watched as they loaded the girl onto a stretcher, her face now hidden by a mask. He had saved her, and now she was gone, absorbed into a world of emergency protocols and medical science he had no part in. A police officer, a woman with a kind but tired face, approached him. "Sir, you're the one who pulled her out?" Liam just nodded, still shivering too much to speak properly. "You're going to need to get checked out yourself," she said, her eyes taking in his soaked clothes and chattering teeth. "An ambulance will take you to the hospital. You're likely suffering from exposure." "No," Liam said, his voice firm despite the shivering. I have to get my daughter home." "She's scared." "Sir, it's not a request," the officer said gently. "We need a statement, and you need to be seen by a doctor. Your daughter can come with you. We'll make sure she's looked after." Defeated, Liam allowed himself to be led to a second ambulance. Inside, the warmth was a painful shock, making his skin prickle and ache as the feeling began to return. A paramedic wrapped him in a thick, coarse blanket and handed him a cup of hot, sweet tea that scalded his throat. Chloe sat beside him, wide-eyed and silent, clutching a teddy bear a police officer had given her. The hospital was a blur of bright lights, antiseptic smells, and quiet urgency. They put him in a cubicle in the emergency room, drew blood, and hooked him up to a monitor that beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm. He answered the police officer's questions in a haze, giving his name simply as Liam and deflecting any praise with a mumbled, "Anyone would have done it." He didn't feel like a hero. He felt cold, exhausted, and deeply worried about the anonymous girl whose life had so violently intersected with his. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, a nurse came in. "Well, Mr. Liam," she said, her smile warm. "You're very lucky. No signs of severe hypothermia, just a bad chill. We'll keep you for another hour for observation, but then you're free to go." "The girl," Liam asked, his voice cracking. "The one from the lake. Is she?" The nurse's smile softened. "She's in the ICU, but she's stable. Her core temperature is rising. You got to her just in time. The doctor said another few minutes in that water. Well, you saved her life, no question about it." The relief was so immense, it felt like a physical weight being lifted from his chest. He leaned his head back against the thin hospital pillow and closed his eyes. She was okay. That was all that mattered. He didn't want thanks or recognition. He just wanted to take his daughter, go back to their apartment, and forget the terrifying cold of the lake. He wanted his simple, complicated life back. He was discharged an hour later, given a set of thin, paper-like hospital scrubs to wear home, as his own clothes were still soaked. As he and Chloe walked out of the automatic doors into the frigid night air, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. The world had tilted on its axis, and then, seemingly, tilted back. But he knew, deep down, that things were not the same. The memory of the girl's cold skin and the terrifying weight of her limp body would stay with him. He hailed a cab, an expense he couldn't afford but had no choice but to incur, and headed home, the eviction notice in the pocket of his wet jeans, a cold, forgotten lump. Alara awoke to beeping. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, a stark contrast to the violent chaos of her last memory. Her first sensation was one of warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to radiate from her very bones. She was cocooned in a mountain of heated blankets. Her eyelids felt heavy, glued shut. She tried to move her fingers and found an IV line taped to the back of her hand. She forced her eyes open. The room was not the stark white of a standard hospital ward. It was a private suite, decorated in muted, calming tones. A large window looked out onto the city skyline, a familiar view. Mr. Baxid. Harrison was sitting in a plush armchair by the window, his posture rigid, his face etched with a worry so profound it seemed to have aged him 10 years. "Arthur?" she croaked, her voice a dry, scratchy whisper. He was at her side in an instant. "Miss Vance. Alara. Thank God." "What happened?" she asked, the memories returning in fractured, terrifying shards. The ice, the fall, the crushing, suffocating cold, the darkness, and something else. A hand, a voice shouting. "You had an accident at the park," Harrison said, his voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the panic he had felt for the past 3 hours. "You fell through the ice. A bystander pulled you out and called for help." A bystander. The word felt so small, so inadequate for the memory that was slowly solidifying in her mind. She remembered the raw strength in the hand that had gripped her wrist, the desperate, strained voice that had promised to save her. It wasn't a bystander. It was a person. A man. "Who?" she asked, her voice a little stronger. "Who pulled me out?" "We're not entirely sure," Harrison admitted. "The police said his name was Liam. He was with his young daughter. He refused medical transport for himself initially, wanting only to get his child home. They eventually convinced him to come here to be checked for exposure. By the time I arrived and inquired, he had already been discharged." "He left?" Alara felt a strange, sharp pang of disappointment. Without anyone getting his full name? His contact information? "He apparently wasn't interested in providing it," Harrison said. "The officer described him as humble. He wanted no fuss." Alara lay back against the pillows, her mind reeling. In her world, nothing was done without expectation of a return. Every favor was a transaction, every kindness a calculated investment. But this man, this Liam, had plunged into freezing water, risked his own life for a complete stranger, and then simply vanished. He had asked for nothing, expected nothing. The sheer, unadorned selflessness of it was the most shocking thing that had happened all day. It was a concept so foreign to her current reality that it felt like a message from another universe. He hadn't seen the Vance heiress. He had seen a person drowning and had acted. She looked around the luxurious private suite, at the state-of-the-art medical equipment, at her loyal assistant, at the life of incredible privilege she had been so desperate to escape just a few hours ago. He had given it all back to her. He had saved her from the cold, but in a way, she was only just beginning to understand. She felt he had saved her from something far deeper, far more pervasive. A new feeling began to thaw the numbness inside her, more potent than any heated blanket. It was a feeling of profound, burning gratitude. And with it, a new sense of purpose began to crystallize. "Arthur," she said, her voice clear and firm, all traces of its earlier weakness gone. "Find him." Harrison looked at her, surprised by the sudden steel in her tone. "Use every resource we have," Alara continued, her eyes fixed on the city lights beyond the window. "I don't care what it takes. Find the man named Liam and his little girl. I need to thank him." The days that followed the incident at the lake were a study in contrasts. For Liam, life snapped back to its harsh, unforgiving rhythm with brutal speed. For Alara, the rhythm of her life was, for the first time, a tune she was determined to conduct herself. Liam woke the next morning feeling as though he'd been beaten. Every muscle ached with a deep, bone-sore exhaustion that went beyond his usual fatigue. The memory of the icy water was a phantom limb, a ghost chill he couldn't seem to shake. He had called in sick to the warehouse, an unpaid day he couldn't afford, but a necessary one. His body simply refused to cooperate. He sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, while Chloe drew pictures. She was quieter than usual, her crayons moving across the page with a solemn intensity. She was drawing the lake, but in her version, a huge, smiling sun was melting all the ice, and a stick-figure daddy with a golden crown was holding hands with a stick-figure Chloe. There was no girl in the water. It was her way of rewriting the trauma, of restoring order to her world. The sight of her drawing sent a pang of love and fear through Liam's chest. He had protected her, but he had also exposed her to a terrifying piece of the world's chaos. The weight of that responsibility, coupled with the ever-present dread of the eviction notice, felt like a physical pressure on his shoulders. He was treading water, and the shore was getting further and further away. He spent the day in a haze of quiet domesticity. He did the laundry, patched another hole in Chloe's leggings, and made a thin stew from the last of their vegetables. Each mundane task was a small act of defiance against the overwhelming feeling of futility. He didn't speak of the rescue to anyone. Who would he tell? His co-workers at the warehouse, with whom he shared little more than tired nods. The silent, empty offices he cleaned at night. The event felt surreal, a strange, violent fever dream that had no place in the grim reality of his day-to-day existence. To the world, he was just a man who hadn't shown up for his shift. A ghost in his own right. Meanwhile, across the city, Alara Vance was marshaling an empire to find a ghost of her own. From her hospital suite, which she refused to leave until she had a lead, she had transformed into a command center. The passivity that had defined her for the past year was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused energy that surprised everyone, most of all Arthur Harrison. "He gave his name as Liam," she repeated, pacing the room with a restlessness that the doctors advised against. "He was with a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, in a pink coat. They were at the west side of the park lake yesterday, between 4 and 5 p.m. That's what we have." "It's not much to go on, Miss Vance," Harrison said, holding a tablet. "The city is vast, and our resources are vaster," she countered, her voice sharp. "I want you to use them. The police report is a public record. Get the full, unredacted version. There must be a home address on his hospital admission form. Cross-reference park security footage, if any exists. Check social services records for single fathers named Liam with a daughter of that age. I want you to be discreet, Arthur, but I want you to be fast." It was the first time since her father's death that she had issued commands with his same unwavering authority. This wasn't about business or profit, it was personal. It was a debt she felt in her very soul, and she would not rest until she could look her rescuer in the eye. She rejected the board's suggestion of simply issuing a press release and offering a public reward. This wasn't a publicity stunt. To reduce his selfless act to a transaction for public consumption felt like a profound insult. The search took 48 hours. Harrison, employing a team of private investigators who typically handled corporate espionage and due diligence, worked with quiet efficiency. They pulled the hospital records, which gave them a full name, Liam Caldwell. They got an address, a rundown apartment building on the city's east side. They pulled public records. The picture that emerged was stark and bleak. Harrison presented the file to Alara on the morning she was discharged from the hospital. She sat in the back of her town car, the city sliding by outside the tinted windows, and read. The file contained no surveillance photos. Per her instructions, only text. It detailed his 2 low-wage jobs, his shift hours, his estimated income. It listed the mountain of medical debt from his late wife, Sarah Caldwell, who had died of a particularly aggressive cancer. It noted the recent foreclosure on their previous, modest suburban home, and it included a copy of the final eviction notice that had just been filed with the county court. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She looked up from the tablet, her eyes stinging. This was the man who had, without hesitation, risked everything for her. A man who was on the verge of losing the very roof over his head. The weight of his quiet, desperate struggle settled upon her. She had been drowning in a metaphorical sense, suffocated by wealth and expectation. He was drowning in a very real, practical one, and yet he had found the strength to save her. Her initial desire to simply thank him now felt laughably inadequate. Thanking him was not enough. She had to do something. "Take me there," she said to the driver, her voice thick with emotion. "To the office, Miss Vance?" "No," she said, looking back down at the address on the tablet. "Take me to this address." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Miss Vance, perhaps it would be more appropriate for me to make the initial contact, to prepare him." "No, Arthur," she said firmly. "This is not something I can delegate. I'm going myself." The sleek black town car, a silent vessel of wealth and power, felt deeply out of place as it turned onto Liam Street. The neighborhood was a patchwork of tired-looking apartment buildings and small, worn-down houses. Children's toys were scattered on patchy lawns. Life here was lived on the edge, a fact evident in the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. Alara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. What was she going to say? "Thank you for saving my life. Sorry to hear you're being evicted." The absurdity, the sheer chasm between their two worlds, was staggering. She was wearing a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, her attempt at looking approachable, but she knew she might as well have descended from a spaceship. The car pulled to a stop in front of his building. It was a 3-story brick structure with rusty fire escapes and a palpable air of neglect. For a moment, she just sat there, clutching the file, her heart pounding. "I'll wait here," Harrison said, understanding she needed to do this alone. Taking a deep breath, Alara got out of the car. She felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her from the windows of the surrounding buildings. She was an anomaly, an intruder from another world. She ignored them, walking up the cracked concrete steps to the front door and entering the dim, musty-smelling hallway. She found apartment 2B and stood before the door for a long moment. It was painted a faded, chipped brown. She could hear the faint sound of a child's happy chatter from within. She raised her hand, her knuckles hovering just inches from the wood. She was more nervous now than she had been before any multi-million-dollar board meeting. Finally, she knocked. A soft, hesitant rap. The chatter inside stopped. She heard footsteps, then the sound of a lock turning. The door opened, and there he was. He looked different than she remembered from her hazy, waterlogged memories. He was taller, thinner. The exhaustion she'd seen a glimpse of in the hospital was now etched deeply into his face. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and worn jeans. His eyes, kind, tired eyes, widened in disbelief as he recognized her. He looked from her face to the gleaming black car parked at the curb, and a flicker of understanding, mixed with deep apprehension, crossed his features. "You," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Behind his legs, a small head with a mop of brown hair peeked out. It was the little girl in the pink coat. She stared up at Alara with wide, curious eyes. "Hello, Liam," Alara said, her own voice softer than she'd intended. "My name is Alara Vance. I believe you saved my life." The hallway of the apartment building seemed to shrink around them. charged with a silence more profound than the one Alara had sought on the lake. Liam simply stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the pale, half-drowned girl from his memory with the poised, healthy young woman standing before him. She looked like she belonged on a magazine cover, not in the dim, peeling hallway of his building. His hand, still resting on the doorknob, felt clammy. "Miss Vance," he finally managed, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He instinctively took a half-step back, a subconscious gesture to widen the chasm that already existed between them. Chloe, sensing her father's tension, pressed closer against his leg, her curious gaze never leaving Alara. "May I come in for a moment?" Alara asked, her voice betraying a nervousness that surprised him. It momentarily chipped away at the impossibly polished image she presented. "Please." Liam hesitated. The thought of this woman, who was likely followed by headlines and dollar signs, stepping into his sparse, failing castle, was deeply unsettling. His home was his sanctuary, but it was also a testament to his struggles. The worn-out sofa, the threadbare rug, the faint smell of the vegetable stew he'd reheated for lunch, it all felt like an open book of his poverty he didn't want her to read. But to refuse would be rude, and rudeness wasn't in his nature. More than that, he saw a genuine, almost pleading look in her eyes. He stepped aside, holding the door open. "Of course." End of tea. Alara entered, her movements tentative, as if she were stepping into a fragile, sacred space. The apartment was exactly as she had pictured from the file, yet entirely different. The report had detailed poverty. The reality showed dignity. Everything was meticulously clean. Chloe's colorful drawings were taped to the walls in a cheerful, defiant gallery against the encroaching drabness. A small, wilting plant sat on the windowsill, evidence of an attempt to nurture life in a difficult environment. It was the home of someone who hadn't given up, and that struck her more powerfully than any display of wealth could have. "Daddy, who is it?" Chloe whispered, her voice loud in the quiet room. "This is a friend, Sweet Pea," Liam said, the word feeling both untrue and somehow deeply accurate. He gestured towards the sofa. "Please, have a seat." "How?" Alara sat on the edge of the cushions, which sighed under her weight. She placed her expensive leather handbag on the floor beside her, where it looked glaringly out of place. Liam remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture he wasn't even aware of adopting. An awkward silence descended, thick with unspoken words. Alara was the first to break it. "I'm sorry to just show up like this," she began. "My assistant, well, he found your address. I hope that's not an intrusion." "It's fine," Liam said, though it wasn't. "I'm just glad to see you're okay. Really okay." "Thanks to you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Liam, I don't think you understand. You didn't just pull me from some cold water. You saved my life. The doctors were very clear about that." He just shook his head, looking down at the floor. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," she said, her voice firm, cutting through his attempt at deflection. "That's not true. Most people would have hesitated. They would have weighed the risk or just stood on the shore and called for help. You didn't. You acted. I want to thank you. Properly." This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment the transaction would be proposed. He braced himself. Alara reached into her handbag and pulled out a checkbook. It was bound in dark green leather, the name Vance Industries embossed in subtle gold lettering at the top. The sight of it made Liam's stomach clench. "I know money can't possibly equate to what you did," she said, her pen hovering over a blank check. "But it can help. Please write any number you want on this. Pay off your debts. Buy a new house, a new car, anything. It would be a fraction of what you've given me." Liam looked from the checkbook to her earnest face, and a quiet but unshakable resolve settled over him. He had faced down the icy water of the lake. He could face this. "No thank you, Miss Vance," he said, his voice soft but firm. Alara stopped, her pen frozen in midair. "I'm sorry? I can't accept that," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes held no anger, only a profound and weary dignity. "I didn't do it for a reward. I saw someone in trouble, and I helped. That's the end of it. Taking money for it would change it. It would make it something ugly." "Ugly? But I owe you a debt," she insisted, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. She was used to problems being solved, to transactions being completed. This quiet refusal was an obstacle she didn't know how to navigate. This is a debt I desperately need to repay. Some debts can't be paid with money, Liam said simply. He saw the flash of the eviction notice in his mind's eye, a stark counterpoint to the offer in front of him. The irony was a bitter pill. He needed the money more than he needed his next breath. But his pride, his sense of self, was the one thing he had left that wasn't for sale. It was the only inheritance he could give his daughter. He looked at Chloe, who was now watching them both with a child's unfiltered perception. He wanted her to see her father as a man who stood for something, even when he had nothing. Alara followed his gaze to the little girl, and then her eyes swept across the room again, truly seeing it this time. She saw the worn-out state of Chloe's shoes, tucked neatly by the door. She saw the stack of envelopes on the kitchen table, the same kind of envelopes she had read about in the file. She saw the quiet desperation he was trying so hard to hide behind his pride, and in a flash of insight, she understood. Handing him a check wasn't a reward. It was a dismissal. It was a way for her to balance the books and walk away, leaving him in the same circumstances but with a heavier wallet. It was an insult to the very character of the man who had saved her. His heroism wasn't a service to be paid for. It was a part of who he was. To try and buy it would be to devalue it completely. She slowly, deliberately, closed the checkbook and placed it back in her bag. A wave of shame washed over her. She had come here thinking like a CEO, trying to solve a problem with capital, when this was never about capital. It was about humanity. "You're right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. That was the wrong way to approach this." Liam's posture relaxed slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. He had been seen. He had been understood. "I'm just glad you're safe," he repeated, the words now feeling like a genuine end to the conversation. Alara stood up, her mind racing. The problem wasn't solved. It had just become more complex, more interesting. She couldn't just give him a handout, but she couldn't walk away and do nothing, either. That felt like an even greater betrayal of his actions. He needed help, but he needed it in a way that honored his dignity, that empowered him rather than diminished him. He needed an opportunity, not a charity case. "I need to think," she said, more to herself than to him. "There has to be a better way, a right way." She walked to the door, turning back to face him. The chasm between them was still there, but it was no longer an impassable void. It was a space filled with a new, unspoken understanding. "Thank you, Liam," she said, and this time the words felt different. They weren't just a prelude to a financial offer. They were simple, direct, and from the heart. "For everything, for saving me and for teaching me something just now." He simply nodded, a flicker of a smile touching his lips for the first time. As Alara walked back down the musty hallway and out into the cold afternoon air, the world looked different. The problem of how to repay Liam Caldwell was no longer a burden of debt. It was a creative challenge, a puzzle of character and circumstance. As she slid back into the plush leather seat of her town car, an idea, faint and unformed but alight with possibility, began to spark in her mind. It was an idea that had nothing to do with a checkbook and everything to do with the man she had just met. The ride back to the Vance Industries headquarters was a silent one. Alara didn't look at the city blurring past her window. Her focus was entirely inward, her mind a whirlwind of activity. The encounter with Liam had fundamentally shifted her perspective. Her mission was no longer simply to repay a debt. It was to find a solution that was as decent and dignified as the man himself. A handout would save him for a month. An opportunity could save him for a lifetime. When she swept into the top-floor executive suite, she carried with her an aura of authority that had been absent for a year. The staff, used to her listless presence, straightened their postures and exchanged surprised glances. She bypassed her own opulent office and went straight to Arthur Harrison's. "Arthur," she said, closing the door behind her, "cancel my afternoon. We have work to do. I want to know everything about the Vance Charitable Foundation." Harrison, ever the professional, raised an eyebrow but immediately pulled up the relevant files on his monitor. "Of course, Miss Vance. The foundation was your father's passion project. It has an endowment of nearly $2 billion. Our primary focuses are on medical research and university scholarships. We donate to large, established institutions. Very low-risk, high-impact philanthropy." "High impact on paper," Alara mused, pacing his office. "Big checks to big names. It's clean. Impersonal. Does the foundation have any programs for direct community aid? For individuals? For the people who fall through the cracks of the big institutions? Harrison scrolled through pages of data. Very few. Your father believed in macro solutions. He felt that helping individuals, while noble, was inefficient. A statistical anomaly, as he called it. The phrase landed with a thud. Liam Caldwell was a statistical anomaly, a good man being crushed by a system that had no category for him. Well, Alara said, stopping her pacing to look directly at Harrison. I think it's time we started paying attention to the anomalies. My father built this company by identifying gaps in the market. I'm going to honor his legacy by finding the gaps in our charity. The idea that had sparked in her mind was now taking brilliant, vivid shape. The foundation has a board, correct? Yes, you are the chair, of course. The other members are… I don't need the names right now, she interrupted, a wave of her hand dismissing the detail. What I need is a proposal. We are going to create a new position within the foundation, a new department if necessary, a community outreach division. Its sole purpose will be to identify and support grassroots-level individuals and organizations that are making a real difference but lack the resources or the savvy to navigate traditional grant application processes. Oh, get her. Harrison was beginning to see where she was going. A slow smile of understanding spread across his face. An intriguing and bold initiative, Miss Vance. And I have the perfect person to run it, she said, her voice filled with conviction. Someone whose primary qualification isn't a business degree, but a PhD in empathy. Someone whose life experience makes him an expert in identifying need because he lives it every day. For the next 24 hours, Alara was a force of nature. She convened an emergency virtual meeting with the Foundation's board. She laid out her vision with a passion and clarity that left the stuffy, data-driven members momentarily speechless. She didn't talk about ROI or metrics. She talked about human dignity. She told them the story, a carefully edited version of an extraordinary act of kindness, and the quiet hero behind it. She argued that the Foundation's greatest asset wasn't its money, but its potential to connect with the very people it was meant to serve. She was no longer her father's shadow. She was a leader in her own right. Simultaneously, she had her legal and financial teams working on 2 other fronts. With a few quiet, powerful phone calls, she arranged to anonymously buy Liam's mortgage debt from the bank that held it, and then, through a third-party legal firm, to cancel it entirely. She also instructed her wealth managers to establish an irrevocable educational trust, naming Chloe Caldwell as the sole beneficiary. She was building not a reward, but a rescue package. A new beginning, delivered with dignity. 2 days after her first visit, a different car appeared on Liam's street. It was still a luxury sedan, but less ostentatious. This time, it was Arthur Harrison who stepped out, carrying a slim leather portfolio. He walked up the steps and knocked on the door of apartment 2B. Liam opened it, his expression wary. Seeing the impeccably dressed older man, he braced himself for another, perhaps more forceful, attempt at a handout. Mr. Caldwell, Harrison said with a polite, respectful nod. My name is Arthur Harrison. I work for Miss Vance. May I have a moment of your time? I assure you, I am not here to offer you a check. The last sentence disarmed Liam. Intrigued, he let him in. Harrison's presence was formal, but not condescending. He waited until Liam was seated before taking a seat himself. Mr. Caldwell, he began, placing the leather portfolio on the small coffee table between them. Miss Vance was deeply affected by her conversation with you. She understands and respects your position completely. However, she remains adamant that your selfless act should not be followed by personal hardship for you and your daughter. She has instructed me to present you with this. It is not charity. It is a restructuring. With careful hands, Harrison opened the portfolio. He slid the first document across the table. It was a legal deed. Liam's eyes scanned the formal language, the words blurring until 3 of them leaped out in stark, unbelievable clarity. Debt paid in full. It was the official deed to his apartment, the mortgage canceled, the property his, free and clear. Liam stared at it, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The weight of the impending eviction, a pressure that had been physically crushing him for weeks, suddenly vanished. He felt lightheaded, dizzy with the sheer absence of that fear. He picked up the paper, his hands trembling. He read it again. It was real. The dragon, had been slain. How? He whispered, looking at Harrison. Miss Vance believes that a person's home should be a sanctuary, not a source of anxiety, Harrison said simply. Before Liam could even begin to formulate a response, Harrison slid a second document from the portfolio. This one was titled, The Chloe Caldwell Education Fund. It was a certificate of trust, outlining the establishment of a $500,000 fund, professionally managed, to be used exclusively for Chloe's future educational expenses, from elementary school tutoring to any university in the world she chose to attend. This was the blow that shattered Liam's composure. It wasn't about him. It was about her. It was the promise of a future for his daughter he had only dared to dream of in his most secret, desperate moments. A future where she wouldn't be held back by his poverty. A future where her bright mind could take her anywhere. He thought of her wearing a cap and gown, of her potential being truly unlocked, and a thick, painful lump formed in his throat. He bowed his head, and a single, hot tear he couldn't stop fell onto the worn fabric of his jeans. This wasn't a gift he could refuse out of pride. This was for Chloe. And finally, Harrison said gently, giving him a moment to compose himself. He presented the third and final document. It was a letter, printed on thick, creamy letterhead from the Vance Foundation. It was an official job offer. Position, Community Outreach Liaison. Department, Special Projects. Grassroots Initiatives. Description: the role requires a candidate with a unique and intimate understanding of community-level challenges. Responsibilities include identifying, vetting, and advocating for individuals and small organizations in need of support, acting as a bridge between the foundation and the communities it aims to serve. Life experience is the primary qualification. The salary listed at the bottom was more than he currently made in a year from both his jobs combined. Liam read the job description, and his breath hitched. They weren't just giving him a job, they were giving him a purpose. They had taken his greatest perceived weakness, his life of struggle, and reframed it as his greatest strength. He wouldn't be a charity case in a corporate office. He would be their expert, their ambassador of hardship. He looked up at Harrison, his eyes wide with a storm of emotions, disbelief, gratitude, fear. I don't have a degree. I stock shelves. I mop floors. I can't do this. Miss Vance believes you are the only person who can, Harrison replied, his voice calm and certain. She is not hiring you for the skills you think you lack, Mr. Caldwell. She is hiring you for the character you have already proven you possess. Harrison stood up, leaving the portfolio on the table. There is no pressure. The first two items are already done and are not contingent on your acceptance. This offer is simply an opportunity. Miss Vance asked me to tell you that she doesn't want to just solve your problems. She wants to invest in your potential. Please, take your time to consider it. With another polite nod, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Liam sat alone in the sudden silence of his apartment, a kingdom he now owned. He stared at the three documents spread before him. Relief, hope, purpose. It was a future laid out on his coffee table. Have felt unworthy, have felt terrified, have felt like a fraud. Just then, Chloe came out of her room, holding one of her drawings. It was the one of him with the golden crown. She held it up for him to see. See, Daddy, she said, her voice full of simple, unwavering faith. You're a king, and kings can do anything. He looked at her bright, hopeful face and then back at the job offer. The fear was still there, but for the first time in a very long time, it was overshadowed by something else. A flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, his daughter was right. Accepting the job offer was one thing. Walking through the gleaming glass doors of the Vance Industries Tower was another entirely. 1 week after Harrison's visit, Liam stood in the immense, marble-floored lobby, feeling as out of place as a stray dog in a palace. He was wearing a new suit, the first he'd owned in over a decade. He had bought it off the rack at a department store, and while it was the most expensive piece of clothing he'd ever purchased, it felt like a costume. The tie felt like a noose, and the crisp, white shirt was stiff and unfamiliar against his skin. The air inside the tower was different. It was climate-controlled to a perfect, unwavering temperature, yet it possessed a chill that had nothing to do with degrees. It was the cool, impersonal hum of immense power and wealth. The people who strode purposefully through the lobby were sleek, confident, and moved with an easy sense of belonging that he could only envy. He clutched the strap of his new, inexpensive briefcase, his knuckles white. This was a different kind of cold than the lake, less immediately lethal, but in its own way, just as dangerous. It was the cold of exclusion. He gave his name to the receptionist at the massive security desk, and her polite, professional smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ah, yes, Mr. Caldwell. For the Vance Foundation, 34th floor." The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. When the doors opened onto the 34th floor, he was met with an expanse of quiet, dove-gray carpeting, minimalist art, and glass-walled offices. It was a world of hushed phone calls and the soft clicking of keyboards. Mr. Harrison met him by the elevator bank, his warm smile a welcome anchor in this alien environment. "Liam." "Welcome," Harrison said, shaking his hand firmly. "We're so pleased to have you with us." Harrison gave him a tour, introducing him to a few key people. They were all polite, their handshakes brief, their smiles fleeting. Liam felt their eyes sizing him up, a subtle curiosity in their gazes. He knew his story, or some version of it, had likely circulated. He was Alara's project, the janitor she'd hired. The thought made his skin prickle with a familiar sense of inadequacy. His own office was small but had a staggering view of the city. There was a brand new computer on his desk, its screen a dark, intimidating mirror. He had used computers for basic tasks, but the corporate software, the calendars, the internal messaging systems, it was a foreign language. The first week was a trial by fire. He was drowning in a sea of acronyms, spreadsheets, and corporate protocols. He spent hours in orientation meetings about HR policies and expense reporting, understanding only half of what was said. He felt like an imposter, a fraud waiting to be exposed. The confidence he'd felt when he accepted the job had evaporated, replaced by the gnawing fear that he had made a terrible mistake. The primary source of his unease came in the form of a man named Sterling Hayes. Hayes was a senior director on the foundation's board, a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his late 40s with silvering temples and an air of perpetual, mild disapproval. He had been a close confidant of Alara's father and viewed Alara's new initiative with thinly veiled skepticism. He visited Liam on his third day, appearing in his office doorway without knocking. "Caldwell," he said, his tone clipped and efficient. "Sterling Hayes. I oversee the foundation's financial allocations. I wanted to welcome you aboard personally." The words were welcoming, the tone was anything but. "Mr. Hayes, it's a pleasure," Liam said, standing up a little too quickly. Sterling's eyes swept the small office, lingering for a moment on Liam's off-the-rack suit. "Miss Vance is very passionate about this new direction. She believes your unique perspective will be an asset." He said the words unique perspective as if they were a euphemism for complete lack of qualifications. I braided. "I hope to be," Liam replied, his voice steady despite the nervous thrumming in his chest. "Good, because our endowment is not a fund for sentimental gestures," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a confidential but firm tone. "It's a strategic tool. Every dollar we allocate must have a measurable return on investment. I'll be expecting your initial proposals to be supported by hard data, cost-benefit analyses, and clear, quantifiable metrics for success. Sentiment doesn't balance our books." He gave a thin, bloodless smile. "Just some friendly advice, glad to have you." And then he was gone, leaving a chill in the air that lingered long after he had departed. Sterling's words echoed in Liam's mind for days. Hard data, metrics, ROI. How could he quantify the value of a warm meal for a homeless person? How could he create a spreadsheet that measured the impact of giving a struggling family enough money to fix their car so they could get to work? The corporate world demanded that compassion be translated into a language he didn't speak. He felt more lost than ever. He spent his evenings at home, poring over books on grant writing and nonprofit management he'd checked out from the library. He was a diligent student, but the jargon felt like a wall between him and the people he was supposed to be helping. Alara, to her credit, was a constant source of support. She checked in on him daily, not as a boss, but as a friend. She had lunch with him in the corporate cafeteria, ignoring the curious stares. "Don't listen to Sterling," she told him during one of these lunches, after he confessed his feelings of inadequacy. "He's a numbers man. He saw my father turn philanthropy into a science, and he can't comprehend turning it back into an art. He sees people as data points. You see them as people. That's why you're here." Her faith in him was a lifeline, but he knew he had to prove her right. He couldn't just be the boss's pet project. He had to deliver. The breakthrough came at the end of his second week. Instead of sitting in his office staring at a blank screen, he decided to do the job the only way he knew how. He went into the field. He took a bus to one of the city's most neglected neighborhoods, a place the Vance Foundation's macro solutions had never touched. He walked the streets, not as a corporate liaison, but as a man who understood the landscape of struggle. He found it in the basement of a crumbling church, the Our Daily Bread soup kitchen. It was run by a formidable 60-year-old woman named Maria, who operated the entire thing on a shoestring budget of small donations and her own pension. The place was clean but dilapidated. An ancient freezer hummed precariously in the corner, and they were running low on everything from canned goods to cleaning supplies. They served a hot meal to over 100 people a day, no questions asked. They were exactly the kind of statistical anomaly Alara had talked about. Liam spent the entire afternoon there. He didn't take notes or conduct an interview. He washed dishes. He chopped vegetables. He sat and talked with the people who came for a meal, listening to their stories. He heard about lost jobs, health crises, and the simple, crushing weight of bad luck. He saw in their faces the same fear and desperation he knew so intimately. He returned to his gleaming office tower that evening, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Sterling wanted data? Fine. Liam would give him data, but he would give it to him his way. He sat down at his computer and began to write. He didn't open a spreadsheet, he opened a word processor. He didn't write a formal proposal, he wrote a story. He wrote about Maria, her tireless work, and her fear that the ancient freezer would finally give out before winter. He wrote about a young man he'd met, a veteran who was sleeping in his car but came to the kitchen every day because it was the only place he felt a sense of community. He wrote about a mother who relied on the kitchen to ensure her children had at least one nutritious meal a day. He painted a picture with words, full of an empathy and raw honesty that could never be captured in a chart or graph. At the end, he attached a simple, one-page budget, a new commercial-grade freezer, funding for 6 months of groceries, and a modest stipend for Maria, so she wouldn't have to choose between buying bread for the kitchen or medication for herself. The return on investment, he wrote in the final line, is not measured in dollars, but in dignity. He emailed the proposal to Sterling and the entire foundation board, including Alara, and then went home, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. The next morning, his office phone rang. It was Sterling. Caldwell, my office now. The voice was unreadable. Liam walked the long gray carpet to Sterling's corner office, feeling like a student on his way to the principal. Sterling was standing by his window, holding a tablet with Liam's proposal on the screen. I read your story, Sterling said without turning around. He was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Liam prepared himself for the dismissal, the lecture on corporate procedure. Finally, Sterling turned. His expression was not angry. It was thoughtful. My first job as a teenager was washing dishes in a place a lot like that, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual corporate armor. I'd forgotten what it smelled like. He looked at Liam, and for the first time, he saw him not as Alara's project, but as a man who understood something fundamental that he had long ago lost sight of. The board has approved the funding, Sterling said, his voice returning to its usual briskness, but the edge of condescension was gone. All of it. Get it done. Liam stood there for a second, stunned. Then a slow, wide grin spread across his face. He had done it. He had navigated the cold, foreign world on his own terms. He had used his own voice, and they had listened. As he walked back to his own office, the 34th floor felt a little warmer, the air a little easier to breathe. He still had a lot to learn, but he now knew he belonged. He wasn't an imposter. He was a bridge. 6 months passed, and the seasons turned. The relentless, biting cold of winter slowly gave way to the tentative warmth of spring, which then blossomed into the full, vibrant life of summer. The changes in the weather were mirrored by the changes in Liam's life. The weary, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet confidence. He no longer felt like an imposter in his suit. He wore it with the easy assurance of a man who knows his purpose. His work at the foundation had become his calling. The success with Maria's soup kitchen was just the beginning. He had a gift for finding the cracks in the system and the people who had fallen through them. He advocated for a halfway house for recovering addicts, secured funding for a small after-school arts program in a low-income neighborhood, and arranged a grant for a mobile library that brought books to elderly and homebound residents. He was a master storyteller, his proposals resonating with the board because they were rooted in authentic human experience. Even Sterling Hayes had become a grudging admirer, occasionally stopping by Liam's office to discuss a case file with a newfound respect. Life at home had transformed as well. Chloe was thriving. With the educational fund, Liam had enrolled her in a new school with smaller class sizes and more resources. She was taking art classes on Saturdays, her natural talent nurtured by proper instruction. Their small, now-owned apartment felt less like a castle under siege and more like a true home, a place of warmth, laughter, and security. The ghost of the eviction notice was banished forever. His relationship with Alara had also settled into a comfortable, genuine friendship. The initial dynamic of rescuer and victim, or employee and benefactor, had dissolved. They were simply Liam and Alara. They had lunch together at least once a week. He would tell her about the people he was meeting, his stories grounding her in a reality far from her boardrooms and balance sheets. She, in turn, would talk to him about the pressures of her role, the endless expectations. He was the one person she could speak to without a filter, the one person who saw her not as Vance Industries personified, but as a young woman trying to find her way. It was on a bright, warm Saturday in July that Alara made the suggestion. They were sitting in a small cafe, Chloe happily occupied with a sketchbook and a large hot chocolate. "I was thinking," Alara said, stirring her tea, "we should go to the park today, all three of us." Liam looked up, a little surprised. They had never talked about the lake since that first awkward meeting in his apartment. It was the unspoken event that had started everything, a silent, powerful presence in their friendship. He wasn't sure if returning there was a good idea. Seeing the hesitation in his eyes, Alara added gently, "I think it's time. The lake doesn't have to be a bad memory. We can make it a good one." He looked at Chloe, who was drawing a picture of a vibrant, sun-drenched park. He looked back at Alara, whose own eyes were no longer haunted, but clear and steady. She was right. It was time to go full circle. The park was a different world from the one they had last seen together. The stark, skeletal trees were now heavy with lush green leaves. The ground, once covered in a blanket of snow, was a carpet of soft, manicured grass. Laughter and the cheerful shouts of children replaced the desolate winter silence. And the lake, once a treacherous white expanse of ice, was now a brilliant sapphire blue, its surface sparkling and dancing under the summer sun. Ducks glided peacefully across the water, and small rowboats drifted lazily in the distance. They walked along the shore, Chloe running ahead to chase a butterfly. Liam and Alara followed at a slower pace, a comfortable silence between them. They eventually found an empty bench, the very same one Liam had pointed out to Chloe all those months ago, showing her the frost patterns on its surface. They sat, watching Chloe as she tried to coax a squirrel down from a tree. "It's hard to believe this is the same place," Liam said quietly, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. "I know," Alara replied, her voice soft. "I haven't been back since that day. I was afraid of what I would feel." "And what do you feel now?" he asked gently. She was silent for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. "Gratitude, mostly," she said. "But I think I'm finally ready to understand why I was out there in the first place." Liam didn't press. He just waited, giving her the space and silence to speak. "It wasn't what you might think," she began, her eyes distant. "I wasn't trying to end my life. Not actively, anyway. I was just so empty. After my father died, I felt like I had become a ghost. People looked at me, but they only saw his legacy, his company, his money. It was like I was trapped behind a wall of glass. I could see the world, but I couldn't touch it, and it couldn't touch me. The loneliness was suffocating. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the weather." She turned to look at him, her expression vulnerable in a way he had never seen before. "I went out on that ice because I wanted to feel something real. Even if it was just the cold. I wanted to find a silence that matched the one inside me. I was so lost, Liam, just completely and utterly lost." He listened, his heart aching for the lonely, desperate girl she had been. He finally understood that when he had pulled her from the water, he hadn't just saved her from drowning in the lake, but from drowning in her own life. "I think I know a little about that feeling." he said, his voice raspy with emotion. After Sarah, my wife, passed away, the world lost its color. I was just going through the motions. Get up, go to work, make sure Chloe was fed, go to the other job, sleep for a few hours, repeat. I was so focused on just surviving, on keeping our heads above water financially, that I forgot how to live. I was drowning too, just in a different way. In debt and in grief. It was the most he had ever spoken to anyone about that time. He had buried the pain so deep, for so long, because he had to. He had to be strong for Chloe. But here, sitting next to Alara, in the warm sun by the peaceful lake, the confession felt safe. It felt necessary. They sat in silence for a while, a profound understanding passing between them. They were not a hero and a victim. They were two survivors. Two people who had met at their lowest points and had, in their own ways, pulled each other back to shore. He had given her a reason to live, and she had given him the means to do it with dignity. You know, Alara said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. My father used to say that ice was one of nature's most beautiful and dangerous tricks, that it looked solid but you always had to respect the hidden weakness beneath. She paused, looking out at the happy, sunlit scene. I think people can be like that too. We build these solid-looking exteriors to protect ourselves, but underneath, we're all a little bit fragile. We all have our own thin ice. Just then, Chloe, having given up on the squirrel, ran over to them, her face bright with excitement. Daddy, Alara, look, she exclaimed, holding up a smooth, flat stone. Can you teach me how to skip it? Like you said Grandpa used to do? Liam looked at Alara, and they shared a smile. It was a smile free from the shadows of the past, full of the light of the present. I think we can do that, Liam said, taking the stone from his daughter's hand. He stood up, walked to the water's edge, and with a practiced flick of his wrist, sent the stone skipping across the sparkling blue surface. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times it bounced, before finally sinking into the welcoming water. Chloe cheered, and Alara laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The ghosts of that winter day were gone, washed away by the warmth of the summer sun and the healing power of a shared human connection. They were no longer defined by the moment that had brought them together, but by everything they had built since. 1 year later. A year to the day since a man had run out onto a frozen lake. The world was not the same, because he had. The scene is a boardroom on the 34th floor of the Vance Tower. It is not the cold, intimidating space Liam first entered. Today, it is alive with energy and purpose. Liam stands at the head of the long, polished table, not in an ill-fitting suit, but in a comfortable sports coat, gesturing towards a presentation on the screen behind him. He speaks with a calm, passionate authority that commands the room. His audience, including Sterling Hayes and other board members, listens with rapt attention. He isn't just presenting data, he's telling the story of a new initiative, a scholarship fund for vocational training, designed for adults who, like him, needed a second chance. He speaks their language now, but he hasn't lost his own. He is the perfect bridge, and everyone in the room knows it. The scene shifts. A sunlit art studio, smelling of paint and turpentine. Chloe, now a confident 8-year-old, stands proudly beside an easel. On it rests a painting, vibrant and full of astonishing color and life. It depicts a park, but not a wintry one. This park is bursting with summer green, and at its center, a bright blue lake reflects a joyful sun. 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl, are holding hands by the shore. Her teacher praises her use of color, and Chloe beams, her creativity and potential unleashed. The scene shifts again. Alara is not in a boardroom or a sterile mansion. She is standing on a half-finished construction site, wearing a hard hat and laughing, her head thrown back in genuine delight. She's talking with a group of construction workers who are building a new community center, a project Liam identified and she championed with fierce determination. Her eyes, once hollow and lost, are now bright with a purpose that comes from deep within. She isn't performing, she isn't a figurehead. She is a builder, a partner, a force for tangible good. The wind whips a strand of hair across her face, and she brushes it away, her hands smudged with a bit of dirt. She has never looked more beautiful or more alive. We see a final, quick shot, the Our Daily Bread soup kitchen. The crumbling church basement has been transformed. A new, gleaming commercial freezer hums quietly in the corner. The kitchen is renovated, bright and bustling with volunteers. Maria stands by the stove, stirring a large pot of stew, a smile of serene contentment on her face. The ripples of one man's courage, one woman's redirected gratitude, have spread further than either could have imagined. The final scene settles on a warm, late summer afternoon. A familiar park, a familiar lake. A red and white checkered blanket is spread out on the grass, laden with a simple picnic of sandwiches, apple slices, and lemonade. Liam, Alara, and Chloe are sitting together, their comfortable silence and easy laughter speaking volumes. There is no longer any hint of the rescuer and the rescued, the employer and the employee. They are not a billionaire, a working man turned executive, and his daughter. They are a family, not one of blood, but one forged in a moment of crisis and bonded by the quiet, powerful architecture of kindness. Chloe leans her head against Liam's shoulder, while Alara points out a funny-shaped cloud in the sky. It's a moment of perfect, ordinary happiness, the most extraordinary treasure of all. Liam looks from his smiling daughter to his laughing friend, and his heart is full. The weight of winter is a distant memory, a ghost exorcised by the warmth of a life rebuilt not just with money, but with meaning. It started with a single step onto thin ice, a moment of profound despair. But it was the second step, the one taken in selfless courage, towards a stranger that truly broke the surface and changed everything. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes saving another person is the only way to truly save yourself. One life was saved from the cold, but many were lifted from the shadows. A powerful testament to a simple truth. The greatest fortune isn't what you own or what you're given, but what you choose to give of yourself. A single act of kindness, like a stone skipped across the water, can send ripples of hope to the farthest shores. Thank you for joining us on this journey with Liam, Alara, and Chloe. Their story is a powerful reminder of the good that exists in the world, and we hope it lifted your spirits today. What did you think of Liam's choice to refuse the initial offer of money? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your perspectives truly enrich our community. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to UpStory and hitting that notification bell. We are dedicated to bringing you more stories of hope, courage, and the incredible power of human connection every week. From all of us here, thank you for watching, and remember to look for the kindness in the world and to be the kindness you wish to see.